Winter on the Pack. The pack had closed around Endurance. In the words of Ord Lees, they were stuck like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. With the ship locked in the ice, there really wasn't much for the crew to do. The forecastle hands, the sailors whose job it was to run the ship, had no sailing to do. Worsley had no captaining to do. But the rest of the men found ways to keep busy. Hurley climbed into the frozen rigging and took scores of photographs, amazing everyone with his fearlessness and yelling outrageous Australian curses just for fun. Green's job in the galley was one that never varied, no matter what, and he had the stowaway, Blackborough, to help him. The crew needed to eat, whether the ship was moving or not. The scientists on board kept up with their experiments, such as they were. Reginald James, the physicist, tinkered with the ship's primitive radio. It was only a receiver, so they could not send news of their predicament, and even under the best conditions, the radio was barely capable of picking up the monthly signal from the Falkland Islands. But that never did come through, even after James rigged up an extra length of antenna wire. Boreholes were drilled through the ice for soundings and water samples. Some of the men tried to create some excitement for the biologist, Robert Clark, by putting some pieces of cooked spaghetti into one of his specimen bottles of ocean water. The closed-mouthed Scottish scientist never mentioned the incident. Hussey continued to take meteorological readings as the summer began to fade. On February 17th, the sun dipped below the horizon at midnight for the first time. The fall was approaching and winter was rushing in right behind it. As for Shackleton, the boss feared that the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition was fated to spend the winter on the ship. There was almost no hope of crossing the continent this year. Making the best of things, he took apart a walking stick made of whalebone discs threaded on a metal rod and used those as poker chips. Card playing became a regular routine. Not that Shackleton had completely given up hope of escaping from the icy prison. The engines were kept stoked and watches were set to scan the horizon for any open leads of water. If there was any chance of breaking free, the boss wanted to be ready for it, and he was burning half a ton of coal a day to keep the engines fired. But by March 16th, winter on the ice seemed inevitable. Shackleton ordered the fires to be burned down. The men all knew what that meant. They were stuck until the ice broke up in the spring. They were all confident that their Norwegian-built ship, with their thick hull, could withstand being locked in the ice. Shackleton's only serious concern at that point was that the ship would adrift far off course with the moving ice pack, causing even more delay. There was nothing to do but make the best of it, and pray that they didn't die of sheer boredom. There was hunting to be done, of course. Now that the trip was delayed by a minimum of several months, the ship's stores had to be supplemented with fresh meat. In February and early March, there had been plenty of life on the ice. There were seals and penguins in every direction. By late March and early April, game was growing scarcer as the animals migrated north, fleeing the onset of Antarctic winter. Daily hunting parties brought in a large store of meat and blubber for the bitter cold ahead. It was pitifully easy to kill the seals. They had no fear of anything on land, and the men could ski or walk up to the trusting animals and club them to death. Worsley manned the crow's nest with binoculars, a megaphone, and a flag, searching the ice pack for seals and then shouting and pointing out the seals to the hunters. At the same time, he kept a lookout for killer whales, which nosed up through cracks in the ice. In order to make the ship's food stores last as long as possible, Shackleton was determined to feed the crew on seal meat, but not everyone approved of the plan. There was some grumbling about seal being fit only for dogs, but the men soon got used to it, especially when it was served as a succulent roast with onions and potatoes. The hunters brought the big seals back to the ship on dog sleds. Without question, the dogs were the most dependable source of entertainment. Many of them lived in kennels built on deck by Dor Old McNeish, the carpenter. But just for fun, some of the men also constructed dog loos on the ice beside Endurance. The dog loo walls were made from blocks of ice, and the roofs were frozen boards of sealskin with snow piled on top. As the weeks went on, the men began to embellish the dog loos into architectural fantasies, adding church spires, minarets, porches, and domes. In spite of the grand accommodations, many of the dogs preferred to sleep outside their houses in the snow. Dogtown, beside the ship, was a noisy center of activity in the middle of a frozen sea, littered with seal bones and dog droppings. There were 6 dog teams for the overland journey to be made once endurance got underway again. The drivers were James McElroy and Alexander Macklin, the 2 doctors, Frank Hurley, the photographer, Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command, Tom Crean, the Antarctic veteran, and George Marston, the expedition artist. The 6 drivers were ferocious in competition with each other, and when Hurley began to boast of having the fastest team, there was nothing to do but hold a race. On June 15th, all hands turned out for the Great Antarctic Dog Derby, held on a course called Epsom Downs, after the famous racetrack in England. Betting with chocolate and cigarettes was heavy until someone broke out some gold sovereigns, and then the wagering turned downright feverish. The frenzied yelping and barking of the dogs was brassy in the frozen air. Nearby, a band of penguins, like an audience of formally dressed opera-goers, observed the proceedings. When the starter's gun was fired, the 910-pound sleds were off into the noon twilight on a 700-yard course, with loud shouts of mush, gee, and haw from the drivers. As the Aurora Australis flickered overhead, Wild came in a dog's whisker ahead of Hurley, with a time of 2 minutes and 9 seconds. Groans of dismay and yells of triumph accompanied the exchange of loot. And it wasn't only among the men that the competition was so hot. In spite of their regular sledging practice and exercise, the dogs themselves were still semi-wild beasts, and dogfights broke out constantly. Bites to dogs and men were common. Dr. Macklin developed a unique style of breaking up these fights. He simply punched the fighters in the head with his heavy, mittened fist. 1 or 2 blows were generally enough to send the fighters yelping into their dog loose. If the dogs spotted a penguin while on a sledging run, they would chase after it in spite of furious yells from the driver. The waddling penguins didn't stand a chance against the dogs. Under Shackleton's leadership, fighting never broke out among the men, even though they weren't exactly cut out to be buddies. The forecastle hands were worlds apart from the university scientists, for instance. Many of the personalities of the men wouldn't have meshed even under the best circumstances, let alone cooped up on a ship with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The men couldn't go anywhere, but in fact the ship was moving. Ever since becoming stuck on the ice, the ship had been steadily drifting north with the pack. The whole ice pack was moving in a clockwise direction, sweeping west and north with the current up along the Antarctic Peninsula. Whenever Worsley could get a good sighting from the sun or the stars, he calculated the ship's position on the charts. They were making steady progress toward the north, and they all knew that eventually the pack would break up as it reached warmer waters. If they could just be patient, they knew they'd get out of this jam. The boss found ways of maintaining a routine in order to keep the crew from going crazy with cabin fever. Each week, every member of the crew, including dogs, was weighed and measured to see that no one was losing weight or eating too much. One night, surveying the bearded, shaggy castaways around him, Shackleton ordered haircuts for all. Worsley described the event. Rickinson, gloating, seizes the clippers and plies them till not a vestige of hair longer than a bristle is left, and his victim looks like one of the Roman emperors. We all get clipped to a man and look like a group of convicts. The amateur barber seizes his victim with the air of a man about to do a mighty deed. He brandishes the clippers aloft. They descend, and a yell of protest arises from the unfortunate object of his attentions. All now look so irresistibly quaint, comical, or criminal that the camera is called in to perpetuate this evening and to cure us, where necessary, of conceit of our personal appearances. Card playing, guessing games, impersonations, listening to gramophone records, slide lectures, reading aloud. The men found ways of entertaining themselves and keeping their thoughts occupied in the long, dark winter months. Worsley gave a lecture on New Zealand and taught several volunteers the Maori war dance, the haka. There was a singing contest to determine the worst singer, and the votes overwhelmingly went to the boss. They even held mock trials, such as the one where Worsley was accused of stealing a trouser button from the offering plate of a Presbyterian church. The skipper was found guilty, of course, much to the delight of the forecastle hands. Arguments arose between the FAFs, that's the Fresh Air Friends, who wanted a hatch open, and the FUGs, the Fetid Undergrounds, who argued against letting out the heat. On June 18th, Dr. McElroy suddenly discovered that he had brought his dice along, and betting with the Rattlers became a popular game. Every Saturday night in the Ritz, as the common room of the ship was known, a ration of grog was issued to all hands. The toast, as always, was To our sweethearts and wives, may they never meet. Shackleton made sure that the ship's routine was always followed. Breakfast, which usually consisted of porridge, cocoa or tea, bread, butter, and jam, was served at 9 in the morning. Lunch of soup, bread, and jam, and cocoa was at 1 p.m., tea was at 4 p.m., and dinner, the most substantial meal of the day, was at 6 p.m. In between meals, there were ship's chores to do, such as cleaning the decks and common rooms, bringing ice on board to melt into drinking water, or rubbing the ice sprouts off of the 2 tons of potatoes stored in the hold. Some of the men looked for any chance to leave their close quarters in spite of the bitter cold. Orlees found a bicycle in the hold of the ship and practiced trick riding on the ice around Endurance. He also took long rides in the darkness until the day he got lost and had to be rescued. Shackleton told Orlees in no uncertain terms that his bike riding days were over. Hurley took advantage of the light whenever possible to take photographs out on the ice. No matter how many odd jobs or errands the crew dreamed up, however, one fact remained. There was really nothing to do on the frozen ship, but wait. Some of the dogs had begun ailing, and this caused a great deal of anxiety for their drivers. After 14 dogs had died, Doctors Macklin and McElroy performed autopsies and discovered that many of the dogs had worms. The ship's stores did not include the proper medication. Several litters of puppies promised to bring the number of dogs back up, however, and the men made pets of the new pups, carrying them in their pockets and taking them aboard as passengers on sled runs. Tom Crean made a miniature sled for his puppies, and Worsley described their first attempt at pulling. Crean put his 4 pups in harness for the first time. Their howls of terror resound for miles around. They pursue a devious and uncertain course, and they flounder and puff and pant along through the snow until their joy they are headed for the ship and for a few minutes drag the hated sledge as fast as a dog team. The men were becoming very attached to their dogs, making straw mattresses for the dogloos, saving special treats for their favorites, and even crawling into the dogloos on occasion to share the dogs' warmth. The puppies were kept on board the ship, where they occasionally got loose and ransacked the stores. Many nights, the dog team set up a wolf pack howl, sending their lonesome cries up toward an aurora australis that was bright enough to cast shadows on the endless field of ice. Cabin fever reached its peak on Midwinter's Day, June 22nd, when the crew celebrated with a raucous party. There were mock lectures and sermons, and then Kerr, the second engineer, made an entrance dressed as a tramp and began singing a ridiculous rendition of Spagoni the Toreador. He started out to high, and Hussey, who was accompanying him on a banjo, kept hissing, "Lower, lower!" Next, Marston took the stage dressed as a country bumpkin to sing Whitcomb Fair. Some of the men played a discord fantasia on homemade instruments, setting the dogs outside howling. At midnight, Green served up a snack of fried bread and onions, which everyone dug into eagerly. Then Frank Wilde tapped the embers from his pipe and stood up to recite The Wreck of the Hesperus by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The Ritz grew solemn and still as he recited the mournful shipwreck saga, and the wind outside shrieked in the frozen rigging. There were no more jokes. The party ended with a toast and everyone singing, God Save the King. The Antarctic winter was half over when the men finally retired to their cabins and bunks. Outside in the darkness, the endless mass of pack ice was grinding against itself like a restless giant, breaking mountains in its sleep.